Dealing with Perfectionism, Impostor Syndrome, and Anxiety with Joe Franchetti.
Hi everybody, it's really lovely to be here today. I'm going to get my slides shared with you now. Let's get this going. So I'm going to be sort of talking through this like it's a presentation, but if you have questions while we're going, please do ask them in the chat and I'll either get to them if they're relevant or I'll get to them at the end. But yeah, I would love to hear what you're thinking. So I'm going to be talking about perfectionism, imposter syndrome, and anxiety in the tech industry and how we can learn to be a little bit more kind to ourselves. So here's a little bit of information about me. My name is Joe Franchetti. You can find me at This Is Joe Frank on Twitter. I am a developer advocate at Samsung Internet. And part of my job as an advocate is to make sure that I'm speaking to a lot of developers so that I can teach all of you about the fact that the Samsung Internet browser exists and make sure that you're testing on it and keep you up to date with all the APIs that are coming out. Conversely to that, the other half of my job is finding out what developers actually want from their browser and feeding that back to our browser developers so that we can start getting the support for the things that you want into the browser. Now, I've been a front-end developer for about 7 years, and I've worked in many different sectors, from small startups to huge organizations, charities to agencies. I've worked in the civil service. I even tried to be self-employed for a little while, but that didn't work out very well for me because it turns out I'm not very good at asking people for money. But what I'm trying to get across with all of this information is that I spend a lot of my time, like a very large amount of my workday, talking to developers, to designers, and to their teams from all seniority levels, from junior right up to, execs, and from many different walks of life. And I've started to notice a lot of trends, and these are trends in behaviors, in beliefs, and in complaints amongst people who work in the tech industry. And so to illustrate some of these trends that I've noticed, I'd like to tell you a story about a friend of mine. Let's call her Mo. And while I tell you about Mo, I'd like you to see if you recognize any of her behaviors in yourself. So this is Mo. She's a web developer and she's got maybe a few years of experience under her belt. She works on a team with some other developers in a medium-sized organization. Now, Mo went to uni like her teachers at school told her that she should, but she feels like maybe she studied the wrong course. But at the time, she was a little bit afraid to change course. So instead, she stuck with the course that she originally chose and decided to reskill when she graduated. And she taught herself HTML and CSS and eventually built up a portfolio and became a web developer. But because she's self-taught, she always had this sort of niggling worry that maybe her skills as a developer weren't as good as the skills of those who maybe studied it at uni. And sometimes she worries that she doesn't know the correct names or techniques for the code that she's writing. But she doesn't want to ask her colleagues about it because she doesn't want to let them know that maybe there's things that she doesn't know. She's worried that they'll judge her, or she's worried that, even worse, they might fire her. She can sort of imagine the shock on their faces if she asks a question like, "You don't know the answer to that? How can you not know that? That's so basic." So she tries to keep up with all the new web technologies by doing things like reading tutorials and attending meetups and web events. But sometimes she feels like everyone else at the meetups just kind of gets the things that she's really struggling with. There are people out there who are writing new and awesome frameworks and tools while she's still struggling to learn the previous ones. And sometimes she feels like a fraud. Mo follows a lot of web celebrities on various social media platforms to try and help her stay up to date. And she's amazed at how much, these celebrities and the speakers at the events that she attends are able to get done during the day. They seem like they're creative geniuses. They never have to ask for help. They never get stuck. Their days just seem to have more hours than hers does. And they've always got side projects on the go. Mo's got a few ideas for side projects, but she doesn't really know how to get started with some of them. And others she can't seem to finish. She's worried that people are going to judge them for being unoriginal or too simple, so she never puts her projects in the public eye. She just keeps tweaking them indefinitely. And if she's really honest, sometimes she just can't face a side project. She's been sat at a computer all day at work, and that's long enough without having to come home and sit at a computer again. But her worry about not keeping up with everyone and not being good enough starts to bother her throughout her workday. And sometimes she's so worried that she can't concentrate on what she's doing. And then she worries that she's wasted time worrying. So she works longer hours and she takes fewer and shorter breaks. But she still doesn't ask for help because that might give away the fact that she can't manage. And in order to hide how worried she is about her own lack of knowledge, she starts doing more things. She starts attending more events, joining web-related organizations, and people often tell her that they don't know how she manages to fit it all in. She smiles and shrugs off their comments. It means that her cover is working because they'll never find out that she's a fraud. Mo sometimes finds that when she gets home from work or after an event, she doesn't have the time or energy to deal with household chores or even with seeing her friends. And her diet becomes quite poor because of all the free pizza that she's eating at the events. And she's drinking far more than she used to because all of these events have a free bar. And even though she gets to bed late, she often struggles to get to sleep at night because she can't seem to get her brain to switch off. It likes to switch between worrying about her workload and running lists of all the jobs that she needs to do around the house. And so because of this lack of sleep and this poor diet and this constant worrying, her ability to concentrate at work starts to suffer. And she finds herself procrastinating a lot instead of getting work done. She'll do things like write emails or check social media, anything to put off actually getting started because she's worried that her work will be judged. And then she panics because she thinks that she's not done enough work during the day. And her daily stand-up meetings become this dread every morning because maybe her team is going to wonder why she's not been as productive as she should be. She's worried that they might fire her. By the way, her team thinks she's doing fine. They only ever see the output of her long extra hours of work. They don't see the procrastination that came before it. And Mo constantly looks to external sources to validate her choices. She never can believe in herself that she's good enough or that she's managed enough. She puts her own work down and instead she lives for her next Twitter likes and her emails from her boss that tell her that her projects have increased revenue. One day at work, Mo gets an email from a colleague saying that she's made a mistake and that she has to change something that she wrote. And something inside of her just kind of snaps. And she runs to the bathroom because she knows she's going to start crying and she doesn't want anyone to see. She cries uncontrollably for an hour, and once she's done, she cleans up her face and she goes back to her desk. She doesn't tell anyone that anything happens. Everyone else around her seems to be able to cope with their workload. She thinks they just tell her to buck up her ideas. And it gets to the point where occasionally Mo can't face going into the office at all. On those days, she calls in sick. But she never tells her boss that it's her mental health that's suffering and not her physical health. And the only time that Mo feels like she can truly relax from work is when she's at the pub with her colleagues. They're not working either, so it means she must be allowed to stop thinking for an hour or so. The only problem being that her team have a bad habit of binge drinking. One night, after drinking herself into oblivion, Mo gets on her bike and cycles home. She doesn't remember the journey. She doesn't remember much of the night at all, if she's honest, but she does remember cycling into a railing just outside her house and catapulting herself painfully across the road. Thankfully for Mo, a few days of concussion and some bruising and scratches were enough to make her realize that she needed to start facing her fears and her anxieties and dealing with her mental health in a better way that didn't involve alcohol. And she started therapy. And she started learning about the causes of anxiety and stress. She started to learn that the kind of mental health issues that she was facing, anxiety related to imposter syndrome and perfectionism, actually plague many people in the tech industry, but people often don't talk about them. Now, if you recognized any of yourself in any of Mo's behavior, I'd like to talk you through some of it now. And as an aside, my DMs are always open if you'd like to talk to me about your experiences with imposter syndrome or with perfectionism or anxiety. You can get me at This Is Joe Frank on Twitter. So I'm going to give you a short introduction into some of the issues that Mo faced, along with some questions to ask yourself some methods of recognition, and some self-care techniques so that you don't ever have to go through what Mo did. Because I really believe that the tech industry is an amazing place to be. We're changing the face of so many walks of life, and our own mental health and well-being has to be one of them. So let's get started. Let's talk firstly about imposter syndrome. You might have heard of it called imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon or imposter experience. But imposter syndrome describes the feeling that you haven't really earned your accomplishments, that by fraud or just dumb luck, you've ended up in the same place as others who you deem worthy, and you don't feel like you deserve to be there. Now, to call it a syndrome kind of downplays how universal this feeling is. It's not a disease or an abnormality, and it certainly isn't always tied to depression or anxiety or self-esteem. But it is very prevalent in highly skilled and highly intelligent people, who are just the kind of people who are attracted to the tech industry. So where do these feelings come from? People like yourselves who are skilled and intelligent tend to think that your colleagues are also skilled and intelligent. And this can sometimes cause you to judge yourself harshly against others. This judgment can cause you to believe that you don't deserve the opportunities or qualifications or accolades that you've earned, or that in some way the skills that you've gathered aren't worth as much as the skills of other people. And this can sometimes be coupled with the belief that any qualifications or accolades you have earned somehow aren't worthwhile anymore or aren't praiseworthy. Have you ever striven to achieve something only to feel like it came too easy, or that someone had maybe made a mistake in awarding something to you, or that the thing that you've just got isn't enough and you have to instantly start working towards the next thing and the next thing? Imposter syndrome doesn't let you feel pride or joy in your achievements. Another problem with imposter syndrome is that our fears can be intensified by a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance. This is where we doubt ourselves in private, but we never voice our doubts, and we believe we're alone in thinking that way because no one else talks about their worries either. And this can be especially exacerbated by things like social media, where people tend to present only their best achievements and their successes. People don't tend to post about their failures or their foibles. They don't publish their mistakes, their self-doubts. So it becomes really difficult to know how hard our peers are working in comparison to us, or how difficult they find certain tasks, or how often they get stuck or need help, whether or not they ever doubt themselves. And this means that there's no easy way to dismiss the feeling that we're less capable than those around us. So with a view to sharing sort of how prevalent this issue of imposter syndrome is, I'd like to share with you some famous, absolutely amazing people who've also suffered from imposter syndrome. So Maya Angelou was one, and even after writing 11 books and winning many, many awards, she still felt like she hadn't really earned her accomplishments. She said, "I have written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they're gonna find out now. I've run a game on everybody and they're gonna find me out." Even the talented and seemingly confident Emma Watson feels like a fraud occasionally. She says, "It's almost like the better I do, the more my feelings of inadequacy actually increases, because I'm just going, any moment someone's going to find out I'm a total fraud, that I don't deserve any of what I've achieved." And if you can believe it, even Albert Einstein experienced imposter syndrome. He described himself as an involuntary swindler whose work didn't deserve as much attention as it had received. And I've found that talking with others about imposter syndrome is the best way to start actually recognizing these fears for what they are. They're normal, but they're immaterial, and they're certainly unfactual. Whenever I'm worrying that everyone around me, whenever I'm worrying that they might know more than me or that I don't feel like I belong, I like to think of what I call Schrodinger's imposter syndrome. So this is the idea that I've convinced myself that my peers are far more intelligent and more accomplished than I am. And yet they're also so stupid and gullible that I, clever me, have tricked them into believing that I belong amongst them. Now, these two statements can't exist alongside each other and be true. My logic is fallible, and therefore likely so is my disbelief in myself. We may never ever be able to entirely banish imposter experience, but we can have open and frank conversations with our peers, with our seniors, with our mentors and our friends, and build confidence in some of the facts. Firstly, you are talented. You're capable. And you belong in the tech industry. So the second thing that I'd like to talk to you about is perfectionism. Now, when I was preparing for my first ever tech interview, I was given a very common piece of advice that I'm sure a lot of you have been given as well. If an interviewer ever asks you what your weaknesses are, just tell them you're a perfectionist. Now, this particular piece of advice was given to me and countless others by my boss in my job at the time. And it's the kind of statement that makes everyone roll their eyes. Interviewers and interviewees alike know it as a cop-out answer. The view is that you're not really revealing any weakness because employers want to hire perfectionists. Perfectionists do great work, right? They do the best work. They do perfect work. And it never occurred to me at the time, as I sort of naively accepted this older and more experienced man's instruction, that I'd grow to learn the real truth behind this statement. So if you look it up on Wikipedia, it says that perfectionism in psychology is a personality trait characterized by a person striving for flawlessness, setting high performance standards accompanied by critical self-evaluations and concerns regarding others' evaluations. Which sounds great. If I were an employer, I'd want to hire someone who strives for flawlessness, who sets high standards, and who cares about others' evaluations. They sound like a real achiever. But the thing is that perfectionism can often be a blocker to achievement. Imagine if you're constantly aiming for perfection, not greatness, not excellent, actual perfection. You can't help but set yourself up to fail. Achieving perfection is just not something that happens often. And perfectionists tend to measure our own self-worth by how able we are to achieve perfection, by how much we can accomplish. And if we don't accomplish, then we can be very harsh on ourselves. The trouble is that for perfectionists, our performance is intertwined with our sense of self. When we don't succeed, we don't just feel disappointed about how we did, we feel shame about who we are. Imagine you got a bad score on a test. If you tell yourself that you're disappointed, but it's okay, you'll do better on the next one, that's healthy. If you tell yourself that you're a failure or that you're not good enough, that's perfectionism. And perfectionists also often engage in something called catastrophic or black and white thinking, where everything becomes either perfect or terrible. And things that most people would call great or good enough fall into the terrible category. An example could be maybe you've made a piece of work, but you're afraid of publishing it because someone might find an error. The idea of somebody finding an error becomes this kind of end of world scenario rather than something manageable that you could work through if and when it happens. Now, I was diagnosed as a perfectionist last year, and it was actually a relief to finally have a name to put to the stress that I was feeling. Every time I made a mistake or had a mental block on a piece of work, I spiraled into this sort of depression and a decision paralysis where I couldn't make myself make a decision, which then made my mental block worse and made my disgust with myself greater. One time, the anxiety that I felt over my own failure to create a perfect piece of work was so bad that it manifested into crippling neck pain, and the doctors actually had to put me on Valium to force me to relax and take time out of work. Anxiety can actually manifest itself in physical issues as well as in, mental blocks. I love the idea of analysis paralysis. That's brilliant. So the problem that we all face is that the tech industry and capitalism and our society as a whole love it when we strive for perfection. They want us to build faster, better things, to be the most successful, to earn the most money. and then you can spend that money on becoming even better. And tech employers often encourage this unhealthy belief that we should constantly be striving to work harder, to create more, to learn everything. And the problem is that the idea of needing to be successful and to turn a profit is drilled into us from a very early age. I don't know about how it works for you in the States, but over here in the UK, we have entrance exams to get into the right schools at 11 years old, and we start training for those at about 9. And then we're led to believe that we have to get the right job straight out of education. Otherwise, we ruined our chances of our perfect career. And perfectionist employees will often pressure themselves into tiredness, into depression, into paralysis and burnout, all while continuing to turn in excellent work. Perhaps the problem's not noticeable to those who are working with them because they never ask for help, because that would be admitting that they can't be perfect all the time. And much like those with imposter syndrome, perfectionists will often disregard their own accomplishments because they don't feel like they're enough. As soon as something that they were working towards is achieved, it's instantly disregarded because it didn't bring that perfect feeling that they were hoping for. So they immediately start working for the next thing and the next thing, and it's an unsustainable and unhappy way to be, and can very quickly lead to overwork and burning out. I think it's a good point that you make there, Twill, that people don't give enough credit to others. I think it's definitely something that would help us all with regards to things like perfectionism if we started sort of sharing credit with everybody that we worked with. Now, when I was told that I might be a perfectionist, I wasn't sure. And if you're not sure whether you've ever had perfectionist tendencies, then I'd like to ask you a few questions to consider. And firstly, the one that got me is this. Would you consider yourself a perfectionist? Now, if you answered as I did, something along the lines of, oh no, there's no way I'm good enough to be a perfectionist, then I've got news for you. How about this one? Have you ever felt like you can't start a project because you can't decide how to start? Sometimes figuring out the perfect way to start your project can be a blocker to even getting started. Have you ever left a project unfinished because you couldn't get it exactly how you wanted it? The project feels not exactly perfect in some way, so you keep adding bits or you keep tweaking bits, and you're not ready to actually show it to anyone or get anyone's opinion on it yet. Have you ever worried and worried about a project and put it off and delayed until the last second, right up until the deadline when you've finally been forced to output something? And then you felt surprised and maybe a little bit silly at how it was all fine in the end, and how everybody thought your work was great. And maybe all this stress and worry and procrastination that you were doing up until that point was just you putting pressure on yourself. Have you ever felt afraid or ashamed about asking for help from a colleague or a peer? Because maybe that will show that you don't know something or that you can't manage something, and perfect people know everything, right? Have you ever found yourself repeatedly scrolling through social media or watching reruns on Netflix or even tidying your house when you know you should be doing something else? Now, there are two sides to this question. As I mentioned earlier, perfectionists tend to procrastinate when they don't know how to start and finish a project, because not working on that project means that it can't be a failure because it'll never be finished. The other side of this question is that perfectionism, and to be honest, capitalism as well, wants us to be constantly working and constantly improving. And when we're not working, maybe we feel like we should be, and that by allowing ourselves downtime, we're actually being lazy. Now, this is the kind of feeling that makes us do things like check our work emails at midnight or first thing when we wake up. That makes us always present on our work Slack. But Our mind needs downtime away from work. You have to allow yourself a real break, time when you're not thinking about work and when you're not making yourself feel guilty over not working. So what can we do as perfectionists and as friends of perfectionists to make the tech industry a safer and kinder place to be? So as I said earlier, the first thing you need to do is to allow yourself time. Sometimes you just can't tackle a problem, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you'll never be able to tackle it. It means that you just can't deal with it right now. So give yourself some time away and don't let feelings of guilt or shame take over. Maybe take a half an hour walk or even a whole day or two away from the problem. But what you have to do is schedule in time for when you're going to start again in future. Set things like deadlines, goals, and targets, and schedules that are realistic. Either set them for yourself or ask someone else to help you to set them. Too much freedom can be quite stifling to perfectionists. We need something that we can aim for and then improve upon. Given a blank canvas, we tend to panic or we'll procrastinate forever, or we'll start and we'll abandon multiple projects. But setting achievable goals allows for striving for excellence while removing this sort of paralyzing nature of open-ended tasks. And once you've set those goals, what you need to do is tell somebody about the goals that you've set, because telling somebody else about them makes you feel more concretely about that goal. It's much easier to wrench on a promise to yourself than it is to wrench on a promise to somebody else. One important thing to remember is that perfect is the enemy of great. Perfectionism, it isn't about high standards, it's about unrealistic standards. How many projects have you thrown away because they weren't perfect, or because you were worried about how others might judge them? How many times have you struggled for hours on a problem because you were too afraid to ask for help? Getting something out is better than abandoning all the hard work that you've put in. And turning to your colleague and asking that question and getting an answer straight away is far better than spending hours struggling and worrying on your own. And you'll likely be surprised that not only will no one else notice these imperfections that you thought were blockers, but they'll think that your work is really great. Try to acknowledge that you are your own most harsh critic. Most people don't expect perfection from people. Perfectionists only think that they do. No one is going to judge you as harshly as you judge yourself. It's okay to make mistakes. Everybody does. It's even okay to release imperfect code. If somebody calls you up on a mistake that you made, thank them. You'll learn from it and you'll both move on with your lives and the world will not end. Try to see yourself as you see your friends. It's easy to start putting yourself down when you make a mistake or you don't meet your own unachievable expectations. But consider how you'd react if someone said the things that you're thinking about yourself to you about one of your friends. I don't think you'd like it. And try and think your fears through to their logical conclusion. Instead of this kind of catastrophic or black and white thinking, like, if I make a mistake in front of my colleagues, that would be the end of everything. Consider what the end of everything would actually look like. Consider the worst possible outcome of your fear, and then be honest with yourself about how likely that scenario actually is. Then you can start to consider how such an event would probably actually play out, and how bad or not that play out would be. So, for example, if you make a mistake in front of your colleagues, your worst fear in the world could be that, the whole room turns and points and laughs at you, and then they just tell you to get out and they fire you on the spot. Doesn't seem a very likely scenario. And sure, one person might laugh at the mistake that you've made. That one person is probably an asshole. The more likely scenarios is that they'll ask you to fix the mistake that you made. And then you get to fill a gap in your knowledge, and life will continue, and the end will not come. Teaching yourself to think your fears through to their logical conclusion will really save you hours of worrying. The more I've spoken about my experiences with perfectionism, the more people have told me about their own similar problems. And with the tendency for intelligence and achievement in tech industry employees, it's perhaps unsurprising that so many people suffer from perfectionism. But the more we talk about these issues, the less stigma we'll feel around dealing with them and helping others through them. Now, if you're a mentor, try asking your mentees what they worry about, aside from a technology curriculum. And if you've got a mentor, try asking them whether or not they've ever felt imposter syndrome, or if they've ever had problems starting or finishing projects and how they manage it. And if you've not got a mentor, consider getting one. Talk to your managers and your line managers if you're worried about how you're dealing with your time or your workload, and don't be afraid to ask for help, to ask the questions that you're worried are stupid, because they're not stupid. And if you don't feel comfortable talking to your colleagues about it, talk to your friends, or talk to me, or even better, find a therapist. I'm always happy to chat. I'm on Slack and I'm on Twitter. So, please do drop me a DM if you just need help getting through a problem that you're having catastrophic thinking about. Everybody goes through rough periods, and we don't have to downplay it. We can validate each other's experiences. It's okay to say, yeah, this is hard sometimes. The more open and communicative we are about mental health in the tech industry, the more pleasant a working experience we can create for everyone. So the final issue that I'd like to talk to you about, and that I'd like for you to watch out for in yourselves, is anxiety. Now, anxiety is an entirely natural and normal feeling. Worrying about a new experience or a deadline or a scary situation is understandable. However, anxiety becomes a problem when you're feeling it generally or over a long period of time. And this is when, as a bunch of people are saying here, speaking to a therapist is going to become really helpful to you if you're feeling this sort of general anxiety state. Now, we learn anxiety as babies. When we're tiny and helpless, we rely on being lovable enough for someone else to give us everything that we need. But for some of us, that need to feel loved and accepted, and the worry that we're not good enough to be loved, never goes away. And we need reassurance constantly that we're doing okay. And in the last few years, we've been given some really powerful tools for checking on whether we're doing okay in comparison to everybody else. Instagram and Facebook, I'm looking at you. And these things allow us to get instant validation on our decisions and our life choices. Posting on social media gives us a means of presenting the lives that we want our lives to be, and to get validation in the form of likes and comments. But we can't help comparing the actuality of our lives with this sort of beautiful, idealized version that others have put out there, which can constantly stoke our fear that we're doing less well than others. Anxiety has many symptoms to look out for. So things like increased heart rate or heart palpitations, which is when your heart does that sort of one big beat. A feeling of tightness or a weight on your chest, or finding it difficult to fall asleep or finding it difficult to stay asleep. If you're getting regular headaches or you find you have sweaty palms, these are all symptoms of anxiety, and they're not things that we want to have to deal with on a regular basis. Now, both imposter syndrome and perfectionism can be causes of anxiety and can impact on your mental well-being. And record numbers of people are experiencing poor mental health, according to the World Health Organization. Depression, anxiety, and suicide ideation are more common now than they have been in a while. And a good prediction of depression is self-criticism, which unfortunately is something that perfectionists and those with imposter syndrome are really good at. Worsening matters, being self-critical not only leads to depressive symptoms, but those symptoms can then make your self-criticism worse, and it becomes this sort of horrible loop. And it's been shown that one of the best protections against anxiety and depression is self-compassion, which is one of the very things that perfectionists are not very good at. So what we need to do is learn how to improve our self-compassion and to apply self-care. Because it really does take patience and practice to break these bad habits. So the first thing that we need to do is change where we look for validation. We're very used to the idea of external signs of success. We're sort of trained into it when we're young. Our parents and our teachers, they tell us we're doing well. They give us grades to tell us that we're doing the right thing in school. And sometimes when we move on to a job and a career, we start to feel the need for that validation, but we can find it less readily. So we start looking to unhealthy sources for indications of whether or not we're succeeding. We want our bosses to tell us we've done a good job. We want to be on the highest salary we can have. We crave that next Twitter or Instagram like. But the problem with external validation is that it's a fleeting feeling. 1 or 2 likes on social media can feel great. A pay rise can feel amazing, but that feeling soon wears off, and we're back to feeling insecure. The idea of self-validation is accepting your own internal experience, your thoughts and your feelings. It's knowing within yourself that you're good enough and that your experiences are worthy, and that you don't need somebody else to validate them. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with or feel good about every single thought or experience that you have. You're still going to have thoughts that aren't justified or perhaps aren't even true, but accepting them allows you to calm yourself and manage your emotions more effectively. So how do we learn to self-validate? Well, firstly, instead of resolving to instantly change your behavior, first learn to recognize it. So when you find yourself engaging in negative thoughts about yourself, or engaging in procrastination, or perhaps checking your work Slack too often, or whatever behavior it is that you're concerned about, firstly, just acknowledge that it's happening. And then you can start to consider it. Once you've reached a point where you can recognize yourself engaging in the bad habit regularly, then you can start to consider reasoning with yourself and reflecting on why you're doing it. And if you're feeling insecure, consider whether it's really you who's insecure or whether it's a societal pressure that's making you feel that way. If you find yourself procrastinating, notice that you're doing it, let yourself have the time, and schedule in a start time in an hour. If you find yourself checking your work email at midnight, check it, close it, put the phone down, don't do it again. Don't berate yourself for it, don't feel guilty, just acknowledge it, accept that it happened, and consider and reflect upon it. Consider what might be behind the issue, where that particular thought has come from, and think about how you might start to manage it in the future. If you have trouble getting to sleep at night, it might be because you've not spent enough time reflecting on your day and all of your experiences. I don't know if you've ever had that thing where you're just lying down to go to sleep and then your brain goes, hey, remember all those embarrassing things that we did today? And you're just sort of lying there sweating instead of getting to sleep. Well, you can actually avoid that happening by spending some downtime, either before bed or whenever is best for you, just thinking about your day and how it went and how you felt about it. No phones, no screens, just you and your thoughts. And while you're doing this, try to consider only the facts. Don't make assumptions. So things like, I got 3 bugs fixed today and I'm really pleased with that. Or, I still have a list of 12 things that I need to get done and that's making me feel worried. Or, my friend cancelled on me for lunch and I'm really pissed off. These are all valid thoughts. But if your brain starts going to things like, I'm a failure and I'm not good at anything, that's an assumption and not a fact. And if you catch yourself thinking things like that, try and consider where that thought might have come from. And I love Todd's suggestion here of maybe writing it out. So when you're considering where those thoughts have come from, think about whether or not you're being driven by a need for perfection, or are you believing the stories of capitalism? Stating the facts of your experience will help you to start build trust in your own internal validation, and it'll help you to catch those bad habits while they're happening. I've seen a lot of people talk about doing things like bullet journaling, where they'll talk about all the things that happened in their day and their thoughts and their feelings and their acceptance of them. And that helps them to sort of keep a record of their sort of mental journey over the last months and years. So the next thing that you need to do is start to put management methods in place. So once you've started to be able to recognize these bad habits, you need to start being able to manage them out, start breaking those habits. So if you need things like help to manage your procrastination, consider using a work timing technique such as Pomodoro or something similar to measure out allotted time for work and time for breaks. And there's a multitude of apps that are available on various app stores to try and help you out with this. If you have a tendency to work too many hours, try and cut down, even by just maybe 15-minute or half an hour increments, and see whether you notice any difference in how efficient you're being. If you're applying for jobs, don't be afraid to ask probing questions about how they support their employees to have good mental health, and find out whether or not they're even comfortable talking about it. Chances are, if they can't talk about mental health in an interview, then they're not going to be able to support you when you need it later down the line. The next thing you want to do is schedule in clear work hours and clear rest hours. That way you can't make yourself feel guilty over not working. You will also know when you should be checking those emails and when you shouldn't. And again, apps and technology can really help here. There are browser extensions that can block social media during certain hours and disable icons on your phone between certain times so that you can really cut your tether to the workplace when you're not there. Ooh. Another thing that you can do, which I spoke about earlier, is finding someone to help you through this idea of catastrophic thinking. The number of times that I've been stuck in a loop where I'm thinking that everything is a disaster, only to turn around and talk it through with a friend and have them say, "And then what?" after I've described my panic scenario. Sometimes you need that extra nudge just to remember that, life continues on after your end of days. So again, if we go back to that, I've made a mistake at work sort of problem. I've made a mistake at work. And, the whole office is going to judge me. And then what? I don't know. They'll probably have forgotten by tomorrow. And we keep going. Talking to a friend about your catastrophic thinking can really help you to work through. We have in engineering this idea of the rubber duck engineer, where you just need to talk through your problems in order to be able to work out a solution. You'll find that the same thing happens with catastrophic thinking. Tell your thoughts to somebody else and you'll start to be able to work past that sort of black and white into those much more gray shades. But find the things that work best for you and just give them a chance. Be truthful with yourself about what is and isn't working, because breaking a habit is hard. And finally, try and get in touch with what helps to calm you when you're anxious or overtired or just feeling a little in need of me time. Now, for some people, it's a walk around the block or listening to music. Somebody mentioned meditation earlier. I like to take a bubble bath, maybe get a bubble tea, but it has to be able to come from you, for you, and not from somebody else. It should be things that reduce your blood pressure rather than raise it. So posting to Twitter doesn't count. That's getting external validation. Texting your crush doesn't count. Eating a kilo of chocolate definitely doesn't count. That's going to massively raise your blood pressure. Drinking a liter of coffee probably doesn't help either. Sorry, Jen. Self-soothing is this idea that you can do these things for yourself to give yourself time to feel validated and happy, to get yourself out of that panic state and back into a place where you're able to properly process your emotions. And why am I telling you all of these things? Because I never want anyone else to go through what I did, to feel alone or to feel unsupported. And because I really think that by talking about it, we can increase awareness and learning about mental health in the tech industry. Because you deserve to feel happy and comfortable where you're working. And the tech industry can be a wonderful and empowering and brilliant place to be. And we all deserve to be there. Thank you so much for listening. And if you'd like to chat to me, you can on This is Joe Frank at Twitter, or you can also get me on Mastodon if you're a fan of the open web.
Thanks for watching.